Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, electric cars in developing countries. I've been obsessed with cars since I was a kid, but I didn't get a license till I was 35. Because for me, driving isn't the fun part. It's everything else that I like about cars, like design. Until I left India when I was 21, I could tell every model of car just by looking at the shape of their front or rear lights. That's how obsessed I was. In any case, cars have been a good obsession when covering climate and energy. Sure, the best climate solution is widely accessible, cheap, electric public transport in every city in the world. But we don't live in the perfect world, and cars aren't going to be obsolete for a long time. So the climate solution for cars is electrification, and what's happening now in the world of electric cars is a big deal. They have impacts at so many levels. At the consumer level, people are starting to learn how to charge when there's cheap power available because utilities are creating new tariffs. And on the geopolitical level, petrostates have to start thinking about how long they can bet on oil in the future. There's always so much news about electric cars. And for years, the best guide on this transition has been Colin McKerracher, head of transport for Bloomberg BNEF. So I wanted to invite him on the show again. And this time, it's because there's something really remarkable unfolding in developing countries. Welcome back to Zero, Colin.
Thanks, Akshat. Great to be back on the show.
It's always a pleasure talking to you because there's never a dull moment when covering the massive shift that the world's transport sector is undergoing. You were on the show in 2023, and I'll remind you that the headline from that episode was titled, "It's Done. The Future is Battery-Powered Electric Cars."
Yes, I remember.
Now, about 40% of our listeners are in the US. To them, that pronouncement might not feel true given the rollbacks from the Trump administration. But surely the remaining 60%, the majority of the listeners, will be nodding along. And in our conversation today, I want to spend a lot of time talking about electric cars and their take-up in developing countries in the rest of the world. But before we start, let's look at the long view. Each year, Bloomberg NEF publishes the Electric Vehicle Outlook. This year's report is your 10th. And there's a thing you do in that report that I really appreciate, which is you look back at your own forecasts and you check whether they are true or you got them wrong. And the thing I notice is that the BNEF forecast has typically become more optimistic over time. So in your 2019 forecast, you were expecting 130 million electric cars to be on the road by 2030. Your 2025 forecast expects 230 million. If we take the long route, why has the optimism grown?
Yeah, there's a few reasons for that. And I think it is really important to say you need to do retrospectives on forecasts. Otherwise, they're kind of useless, right? You need to see what you got right and wrong. And also, you should tell people what you got right and wrong. That's why we publish that section every year, is to say, hey, here's what we were right about, here's what we were wrong about. And so I think just general credibility, you should do that. And also, I will say, I have seen a lot of very optimistic forecasts that weren't reviewed and weren't revisited and are now all sort of comically wrong. So you go back 6-7 years, there's all these people saying 100% of car sales are going to be electric by 2025 or 2030, including by Elon Musk, by the way. He said, we think we can get to 50% of sales by 2026. So it's 2025 now, and we're not there, and we're not going to be close. But so in terms of our why ours have changed, and I'll say, look, from 2019 till now, the size of the fleet forecast has gone up a fair bit, but actually in the last 3 years, it's been level and even slightly down. So 2025 was the very first year where our global forecast went down. And that's because we were anticipating and starting to see now a very strong drop in the US. It's not dropping yet, but the policy levers going away under the Trump administration will absolutely have an impact. And this is an important thing to mention, is that policy still really matters. You still get the policies that you vote for, and those policies have an impact on the market. But zooming out and sort of taking the long view, I think the biggest reason why it's gone up over a 5 or 6 year time horizon is that we reached the point of organic consumer demand takeoff in China about 3 years sooner than we thought we would. So our general view before was that China and most of the markets are policy push markets for the next few years. And then around 2025, it takes off. What happened in China is that around 2021, 2022, organic consumer demand now vastly outstripping what the government targets are. You're over 50% of sales have a plug. The largest auto market in the world, half of the sales are electric. And that is way ahead of what the government targets were. What that means is that kink in the curve where you get organic consumer adoption has come about 3 years sooner than we thought. And so since then, we've adjusted that. In the last few years, it's been pretty accurate. We've been forecasting for the Chinese market. But that's probably the single biggest lever why the 2025 version is higher in 2030 than the 2019 version was.
You were generous in not calling out the oil companies who also put out their electric vehicle forecasts and have been historically getting it really, really wrong. One reason that is because they didn't probably expect, as you were, that battery costs would fall as far as they have done. And in your own forecasting, surely the cost of batteries and thus the cost of cars has played a huge role, right?
Yes, I should mention that the oil companies were also, their forecasts were dramatically off. On the other side, they were dramatically underestimating EV adoption. Battery costs have come down dramatically. We've been tracking that since 2010. That surprised a lot of people. When we looked at some of those early oil market outlooks, the biggest thing we noticed was that none of them were very explicit about what they were expecting on battery costs. And as soon as you started to look at battery costs and battery prices, you sort of concluded, whoa, there's something really dramatic going on here. And eventually you're going to get to price parity between electric vehicles and combustion cars. And that's largely what's played out. Now, not everywhere. Like an EV is still significantly more expensive in the US and depending on where you are in parts of Europe than a combustion car. But in China, it is cheaper. And again, that's part of why you've seen that organic consumer demand take off. And I think this gets at something quite central too, which is that when we do these outlooks, the underlying thing is looking at vehicle economics. So trying to understand when can you make and sell an electric vehicle profitably in different segments and in different markets. And what battery prices do you need to get there? And that's what determines a lot of the uptake, along with some other things around total cost of ownership and fuels and addressable market and all those sorts of things. But I think that's important because you're not just extrapolating historical growth trends. It's really important not to just say, oh yeah, it grew at 15% last year, it's going to grow at 15% this year. It's important to look where can the economics work, are the economics working, because vehicles exist sort of at the frontier of purchasing power for most consumers. So if the vehicle is way more expensive in the same class, same segment, they're just not going to buy it. So you do need competitively priced EVs. We're getting more and more of those around the world. And that's a big part of why you've seen adoption take off. And underlying that is the battery story. And batteries do keep getting cheaper and they do keep getting better. If that ever stops happening, then I will change my view on long-term EV adoption. As long as batteries are still getting better and cheaper, then the future for electrification of road transport is really bright. If it grinds to a halt, then views would change.
Let's talk about the US market briefly, because there's that correction you talked about, given the change in policies that have already come through. But there is a further downward risk that could come, right?
Yeah, so we have revised our US EV adoption forecast dramatically down in this year's outlook. And the biggest thing behind that is that the federal tax credit is going away. So the end of September, it's gone. And then the other thing is that the fuel economy regulations, the CAFE regulations, are being rolled back. And both of those were set to be big drivers, along with some parts of the Inflation Reduction Act that were incentivizing the supply side. So virtually all of those are under threat. Now, the other big pillar of US EV adoption has been California and the standards that California sets for vehicles and the zero emissions vehicle mandate in California. That exists because of the waiver that California has to set its own standards. Trump has gone after that waiver. We're not legal scholars. There's some groups that say that is the mechanism that was used to do that is unconstitutional or wouldn't hold up in court. But the reality is that is a further weakness in the US market. Our outlook this year assumes that California retains some ability to set its own air quality standards and that things like the ZEV mandate in California may be revised but not fully eliminated. That could go down further. So we already reduced our outlook pretty significantly between last year's and this year's for US EV adoption in 2030. We could revise it further if that California ability is confirmed to be removed.
You said that China is now selling more than half of all its new car sales as electric. But there's a more shocking stat in the report, that this will be the first year when China will sell more electric cars than the total number of cars sold in the US, whether that's electric or those massive gas-guzzling pickup trucks. What is that going to do to the competitiveness of US automakers?
Yeah, this was one that came out right at the end, and it'll be Q4, so it won't be the full year where it overtakes it, but in Q4, we think there'll be more EVs sold of all types, not including 2- and 3-wheelers, but cars and trucks, versus combustion vehicles and all types of vehicles in the US, which is pretty remarkable. So it's going from very few sales a few years ago to overtaking the entire size of the US vehicle market, which is part of the reason we say as well that combustion vehicle sales peaked in 2017, because to make up for what has happened in China, you would need to add now an entire new US vehicle market into the mix, all combustion cars, to get back to those 2017 highs. So that means there's just no way to do that. There's no country in the world that can do that. So we have passed peak combustion vehicle sales with growing confidence. And not only are they selling a lot of electric vehicles within China, but the amount of vehicles they're exporting is also rising really quickly. So China has become the largest vehicle exporter in the world, overtaking Japan last year and Germany the year before. There is a real risk right now in the US, and US consumers are not able to access these vehicles that the Chinese automakers are producing because of a 100% tariff, which basically makes it impossible for an automaker to sell there profitably. There is a real risk that the US market is sort of evolving as its own island, if you will. If you think of sort of evolutionary life forms, these islands that get cut off from other parts of the world, they grow different species within them. And there was always a bit of that within the US and North American market, but it starts to look like a stronger effect if the rest of the world is moving much more forcefully towards electrification. And you don't have to go very far from the US or from Canada even to see that. I mean, if you look at Latin America, other parts of the Americas, you're seeing really strong growth in electric vehicles and coming from mostly Chinese manufacturers. So there is a competitiveness risk. I will say, and I've said this before, I probably say this each year, and maybe I need to tone it down a little bit each year because it's no longer, I say it's still early in the transition. It's not that early in the transition anymore. We're at about 25% of global car sales this year are going to be plug-ins. So, and majority of those battery electric. So maybe it's not so early in the transition anymore, but there is still room for this to turn around. And companies like Tesla, though their sales have fallen and a little bit in the last little while in some markets, they are still leaders in electric vehicles globally. So there is still room to compete and to be at the forefront of this. But it does look more and more like under the Trump administration, the US will fall further behind on electrification and on batteries. And it is unclear yet whether that's something they'll be able to recover from if that set of policies lasts 4 years or longer.
Some of the headlines coming from the US are quite remarkable. The raid on a battery plant to pull out workers that came from South Korea, and the sort of machinations diplomatically that had to go on to make sure that they can get back to work and the plant can start operating again. We hear America first, but at least on autos, it feels like you might end up in a place where America is alone. But let's turn to developing countries. And there are two reasons why I'm interested. First, because what is happening in some of these markets is astonishing. I followed these numbers not as closely as you, but fairly often, and some of these numbers still shock me. Second, and more importantly, I think when developing countries start adopting a green technology, you know the technology's time has arrived. Because typically developing countries are buying into it because it's the cheaper, better option rather than because it's going to reduce carbon emissions. And for the last 8 years, I've been talking to my dad in India about electric cars. Every second year, we go and test cars out, what's on offer. And every year, he has said, no, I'm not quite ready. He's a consumer who's only ever had an Indian-made car. So he has this old school thinking that, they provide better services. So I really need to wait till I get an Indian electric car before I buy one. And then foreign cars, even if I tried to convince him about the service, just always felt like things were out of his budget. He's like, no, I'm not buying an expensive car. I'm going to buy one that I can afford. This year, that changed. He was impressed by the range of cars on offer, including from Indian companies, and he felt comfortable buying a car from a foreign company, but with Indian manufacturing. He ended up buying a Hyundai, and independently, a first cousin of mine in Mumbai bought a BYD micro SUV. So in between these two decisions, there is something that is happening. I say that I think of my dad as a bellwether for the energy transition because in 2019, he got rooftop solar just as the Indian solar boom was beginning. And now this year, he's bought an EV. Maybe the Indian EV boom is really going to start. Am I reading too much into what my dad's choices are?
Maybe, but one of the things I love about working on these topics is you get to see them in real life, right? And that's kind of what makes it both professionally interesting, but personally interesting too. I don't actually think you are. And to come back to the point you made at the start about the relative economics, I completely agree. And one of the things we've often said is that, look, the reason adoption has been slower in emerging economies to date is because of primarily a question of price elasticity of demand, right? Consumers are very price sensitive. And when things cost a premium, they're not going to buy a lot of them. But the flip side of that is that same price elasticity of demand doesn't have to change, but just the equation completely flips once that becomes the cheapest option. And that means you go as the fastest buyers because, again, you're price sensitive and you are really seeing that. So again, if you're sat in the US, this might sound surprising, but you're getting higher rates of EV adoption in many emerging economies than you have in the US, than you have even in some European countries. And the list is getting longer. So it used to be maybe one or two, but now you say, okay, actually, we've got quite high rates in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Costa Rica, in big parts of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Nepal, Ethiopia. These are not places that are doing this for some sort of obligation around CO2 emissions or some sense of moral obligation to other countries primarily. Those factors can play a role, but they're primarily doing it because it's the lowest cost economic choice. Now, I think there is a bit of a pushback from some of these countries if they make automobiles themselves to say, look, and India is a good example of this. We want more of it made here. We don't want to import technology. But what you're seeing in places that don't make a lot of vehicles of any type within the countries, they're saying, look, we're importing this either way. We may as well import the one that cleans up local air quality and is cheaper to buy. I've said for a long time that, look, if we wait for electrification to start top down and come from the wealthiest countries, the wealthiest vehicle buyers in those countries and work its way down, this is a very long transition. This is many decades. But if it comes bottom up at the same time, which is what you are starting to see, and again, not just in a few countries, in many countries and in many different segments, two-wheelers, buses, delivery vans, cars, all those are really moving in a lot of emerging economies, then the whole thing goes a lot faster. So India is probably the most interesting one to watch, to be honest, because the numbers are starting to go up quite quickly. You do have domestic manufacturing, so the model choice is going up very fast. It's fascinating to hear your dad sort of relaying that stuff that we're reading about and writing about and gathering data on. It's always neat to hear it come back as personal experience.
And he did test a few electric cars coming from China. So even though India has a tariff, 100% or so tariff, electric cars, even after that tariff, can be cheaper, right? Like my cousin buying a BYD because, well, it was just the best car that he tested out, even though it was just on the budget of what he was buying and was comparable to other Indian electric cars.
I actually wrote a piece just a few months ago saying, look, if you want your EV market to take off, let the Chinese vehicles in, right? And that may be a questionable statement. And I think there are reasons for different countries to consider whether that's what they want to do. But if one of your goals is to catalyze competition, give consumers a lot of choice and see EVs take off, then look around the world, look at the countries that are going the fastest. The fastest growth rates are all in countries where Chinese vehicles are part of the mix. They're forcing competition. They're bringing down costs for consumers. And sometimes I hear in the US, people say, no, consumers don't want to buy these. And I sort of say, well, let's take out that 100% tariff and see what happens. Let the consumer decide. And I don't think we'll see that happen, but it's important to note that argument of let the consumer decide used to be an argument against electric vehicles and saying, no, if you really let consumers pick, they won't pick these. And then now it's an argument for let the consumer decide, open it up, see what happens.
Join us after the break for more of my conversation with Colin McKerracher. And while I've got you, please give Zero a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps new listeners find the show. Recently, Energy Nerd said, I've listened to clean energy podcasts for years, The Energy Gang, Volts, etc. This is one of the best. Key topics, good questions, and important interviewees. Highly recommended. Thanks, Energy Nerd. I want to put numbers on how many developing country markets are playing in the big league for electric cars now. Nepal, 70% of all new cars electric. Thailand, 60%. Vietnam, 40%. No developing country can quite match your resident country of Norway, where 100% cars that are sold are EVs. But barring that exception, we are now at that place where many developing countries have begun to leapfrog developed countries when it comes to new sales of cars. And it's worth noting, these are the markets that will have growing car markets in general. Even if developed countries start selling more electric cars, their markets are stable or shrinking in many cases. So this is happening in emerging markets. It's not a unique story. What do you think are lessons that you can see from these markets that show what needs to be done if even more markets want to adopt electric cars?
Yeah, one of the things I think, to just understand the causes of that and why that's happening. We talked about the economics. The other thing that I think is important to note, if you map every country in the world and say, what are their biggest imports? You will find two things come up in almost every single country in the world in terms of value of imports. One of them is cars and the other one is oil, right? So if you're looking at that and you're an emerging economy and you say, well, look, if I'm going to import the cars anyway, then I'd rather import less oil. And so I think one of the lessons from this is that there are multiple factors that can drive these things forward. And one of them is around energy security. And countries may say, look, we have good hydro resources in the country, and we are going to generate a lot of power from that. And we don't have oil, so let's start shifting the fleet, recognizing that it will take a long time. So I think that sort of multitude of factors playing a role in this is part of why we see different emerging economies pushing harder on it. I think the other thing that we have seen is that, and this kind of goes against my analyst sensibilities, because I like the idea that if you look at enough techno-economic data, you'll be able to predict things. But I have actually found, having spent a bunch of time with some of the people who work in the EV associations in those different emerging economies, that people make a very big difference too. And again, people's a very hard thing for us analysts to predict, but individual people going out and organizing the EV association in their country that then goes and does test drive events, lobbies for things, pushes hard with legislators, just sort of makes the case, makes them visible, makes a huge difference. So I happen to know the people who worked on that program in Costa Rica and continue to work on that. That's been a great success story, and that's really people driven. And that's a small country, but this stuff matters. So I think it's worth remembering that economics and technology are not destiny. They certainly shape the direction we're traveling, but that people still matter a lot. And again, this gets at a point where we're not very good as analysts at quantifying that, because that's sort of an uncomfortable thing to say, look, what effect is people organization going to have? But certainly I would say it does have an effect, particularly for things like getting charging infrastructure up the agenda and all these sorts of areas, because eventually you run out of the early adopters and you run out of the people who have detached homes to charge at home at, and then you need some public charging infrastructure. So I would say those two stick out to me as interesting lessons. One, this idea of we're going to import oil or cars, and let's make a strategic choice on which one it is, and how that changes over time. And then this other part about people still really mattering in that organization effort that makes people, the consumers in those countries, more aware of the options that are out there.
Now, I'm going to put a name on one of the countries that you were thinking about when you were answering your question, which is Ethiopia, the country with hydropower, cheap hydropower, and the country that thinks it's importing way too much oil. So it's banned the imports of fossil fuel cars altogether. And that means it's just open road for Chinese electric cars to sell in Ethiopia. The other country in Africa that our colleagues and Bloomberg News have written about is Nigeria, where the country had a huge shift in the subsidies that it was offering to gasoline. They were taken off, and suddenly there was a solar boom because all the diesel-powered generators had to go away or become too expensive, and solar took off. Electric cars are also starting to see a small boom as a result. Are there other parts of Africa where we should be looking at the electric car transition?
I would say in other parts of East Africa, you're also seeing some pretty interesting stuff on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. In Kenya, I think that's an interesting one to watch too, partially because with the two-wheeler market, the barriers to entry are lower in terms of setting up manufacturing. So what you're starting to see there is some homegrown African companies producing two-wheeler electric motorbikes and electric scooters and three-wheelers for the African market. And so that's always interesting to see as well. There's some other markets where buses are picking up, but I think probably, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, those are the ones that I'm seeing as kind of the most interesting right now. And I think the Ethiopia story is fascinating. Obviously, it's not a huge car market, but it's telling you something about the competitive economics and also this geopolitics of dependence as well.
Now, I want to bring up one sort of future-oriented technology that is not showing up in developing countries yet, but I wonder what you think about it, which is autonomous driving. I was able to take a self-driven car in San Francisco. It was a Waymo. And for the first 30 seconds, I was a little freaked out, creeped out, uncomfortable. And after that, I forgot that I was in a car without a driver. Many of these companies have invested huge amounts of money, mapping the roads, making sure that the car knows what it's doing. Driving is a pretty complicated task if you try and get a robot to do it. But there is a very good reason for combining electric cars and autonomy, because you get this efficiency combo both in fuels and in resources, because you're going to have fewer cars ideally going around more of the time. Do you think autonomy has any realistic role to play in emerging markets where the cost of driving is still pretty low and the roads are much, much more complicated, either in infrastructure or the way people drive?
My view has been generally it doesn't play a huge role in emerging economies. I lived in India for a number of years as well, Akshat, as you know, and I just struggle to picture sometimes the street scene where it would be helpful to have an autonomous car, right? Like I think in some cases, people would just sort of accept that this thing would have to slow down if you got in the way. And some streets that would just be very hard for them to ever navigate, right? And there's just more variety of people and types of traffic and things on the road. So, and also an economic point, the part of the reason autonomy is attractive is because it cuts out the cost of labor of the driver and the asset can be used more intensely. Some of that works in emerging economies, but not all of it. So I generally think this one's probably a wealthy country story for quite a while, and I include China in that. It is really fascinating to see the number of trips starting to go up really rapidly. We had just more anecdotal evidence. I mean, we track all the data, but again, to sort of bring it back to what people actually see and experience, we had our whole Bloomberg BNEF team, about 300 people together over the summer, and I was just giving a presentation. I paused and say, how many people have been in an autonomous car? And more than half the people put their hands up because they've been through San Francisco and ridden in one, or they're based in Beijing or Shanghai. And so that's quite a number, right? And that's gone from zero probably 2 years ago. And the last time I was in San Francisco, I took one in a rainstorm, like a full-on downpour, and it handled everything really, really smoothly. So the technology is getting better. The number of trips are going up exponentially. You're seeing their first permits approved to pick up at airports. And again, if you look at shared mobility patterns, airport pickups is a really big part of Uber and Lyft earnings and things like that. So there's a lot of trips there available. When we look at it, though, in terms of the global energy mix and the global vehicle mix, the number of kilometers people do in a year is in the tens of trillions in terms of total population of the world, how many kilometers they travel by car. It's going to take quite a while to make a material dent in that, and therefore to make a material impact on the energy story. Now, most of those will be electric. Most of those are electric today. Anything where you have high utilization, the economics of electrification are very good, low cost per kilometer, high upfront cost. You're definitely going to want that to be electric to bring down the running cost. And certainly what we see today is I think it's 90% of all the kilometers traveled in autonomous vehicles today are electric. So that's happening. It's not hypothesized anymore. That market is electric, but it's probably more like the 2040s or say late 2030s and onwards where it starts to make a material impact in global transit patterns and global energy use from transport.
We've talked about cars mostly because they form a big part of this transition, but that's not the only place where the electrification of transport is playing out, right?
No, it's not. And it's kind of the middle of the transition. So we think about 25% of cars this year will be electric. That's battery electrics and plug-in hybrids combined. If you go down from there, light commercial vehicles, about 10% will be electric this year, medium and heavy about 4%. So passenger cars are ahead of those two segments, but they're actually behind the two leading segments, which is 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles, which is 39% of global sales this year will be electric, and buses, about 43% of sales will be electric. So when you think particularly about emerging economies, think of this sort of combined ecosystem of different vehicle types. It's not all about passenger cars, but you're seeing progress, rapid progress on electrification in multiple segments at once. So it's not just happening in the car you can picture that you might have in your driveway. It's happening in how goods are moved. It's happening in two-wheelers. It's happening in buses.
I could keep talking to you for a long time, but I do have to draw a line at some place. And there's one I'm going to draw, which is going to take us outside the developing country conversation, back to the global conversation, which is about the demand for oil as a result of electrification of transport. I know Bloomberg NEF has tracked these numbers in the past. How are we doing on displacing oil demand?
Yeah, we've been tracking this for quite a while. And actually what's interesting in the oil displacement story is that early on, a lot of it was driven by buses and 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles. And just now you're starting to see passenger cars start to make a material dent. It's about 2 million barrels per day being displaced right now by electric vehicles of all types. Now, that's against over 100 million barrels per day of oil demand globally. And obviously that displacement has been built up over a decade of selling electric vehicles. But I think where it gets quite interesting is the markets where you're seeing higher levels of EV adoption, because there you are starting to get significant displacement, sort of tells you where you're going. Because there's this kind of mechanistic effect between high share of new sales eventually translates to a share of the fleet, and that translates to demand displacement for gasoline and diesel. So places like Norway, you're getting about 3 to 4% drop in liquid fuel demand for road transport every year, and that's just as the fleet turns over. In China, which has been the biggest driver of oil demand growth over the last 2 decades, various groups, including Sinopec, the largest fuel distributor in the country, has said they think gasoline demand is either peaking this year or has already peaked. Diesel demand they see growing for a little bit longer because of heavy trucks, but you're actually also starting to see pretty rapid uptake of electric trucks. About 16% right now of electric trucks or of truck sales are electric. Heavy truck sales are electric, much higher for vans. So that's starting to displace as well. When we add that all together, we at Bloomberg NEF see global road oil demand or road fuel demand, which is a contributor to global oil demand, peaking around 2029, so within 4 years. Now, that doesn't mean overall transport demand peaks. That's just road transport. With shipping and aviation, you could see that growing for another couple of years. But then our view is that the sort of weight of that road fuel part, which is still the biggest consumer of oil, biggest single consumer of oil in the world, starts to outweigh both the rising shipping and aviation part around 2031, and then you start to get a peak around there. Now, this is a hotly debated topic, but I would say that you can look a little bit just at the fleet of vehicles. Like the biggest thing driving global oil demand is the fleet of combustion engine vehicles on the road. It is still growing, therefore oil demand is still growing, but it's not going to grow for much longer because we passed the peak of sales in 2017. It takes about 10 years for that to fully flow through to the fleet, and then that flows through to gasoline and oil demand. So I think where people go a bit wrong is thinking of a peak as the only thing that matters, because there's different shapes to a peak. Are we talking a Himalayan peak or an Appalachian peak, right? Is this a sharp, rocky Matterhorn, or is this somewhere in Appalachia, which has been rounded off by millions of years of weathering, right? And I think certainly what our data shows is that it's more of a rounded story. Certainly right now, given what we see, this will still take a long time. And unless you see a significant acceleration, there is almost no chance at this point on the trajectory we're on of getting to this talk of net zero by 2050, even in road transport, which is one of the more optimistic scenario, or one of the more areas where there's sort of more reason for optimism. So in our EV outlook this year, we said the net zero by 2050 story is almost out of reach. You would need to see a significant acceleration. And in cases like the US, you're not seeing that. You're seeing the opposite. So this is sort of, when you work on electric vehicles, you have to sort of hold hope and despair and at the same time, right? In some ways, there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful from a technology development point of view, from an uptake point of view, from just a better experience in cities and urban air quality. But if you're looking at it purely from a climate lens, we're still a long way from being on track, and we would have to see more action, not less. Depending on which side of the market you're on, if you're selling oil, then maybe the hope and despair are reversed. If you're a fan of trying to cut emissions and improve urban air quality in cities and offering low-cost vehicles to consumers in the long run, then maybe it goes the other way.
It's funny you bring up the Appalachian Mountains, because there's not just nature that has shaped them, but humans too. A bunch of those mountains have had their tops cut off because of coal. And so humans are driving this transition. And it's been such fun to try and understand where this transition is in developing countries, because that's a place that few people look at, but more people should. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Akshat. Great to speak to you today.
And thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of lithium metal in liquid ammonia. Sounds very different when lithium metal is dropped in water, which would be a big bang. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who is as obsessed as I am with car design. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyd. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Eleanor Harrison Dengate, Samar Sadi, Moses Andem, Laura Milan, and Sharon Chen. I'm Akshat Rathi, back soon.